Narco-terrorism is defined as a drug cartel or narcotics organization that influences the politics and policies of a state through terrorism and engages in other means of violent political conflict. Additionally, terrorist groups tend to have trouble raising money through legitimate means because they can't get a sponsorship from Raid Shadow Legends, so they turn to dealing drugs to raise stacks of cash to buy stuff to conduct terrorist attacks. But there's a difference between terrorist groups that deal drugs and fund terrorist attacks through drugs, and drug cartels that also do terrorist attacks. I'll elaborate more on this when I get into examples, but the point is that dealing drugs doesn't necessarily make a group a terrorist cartel or transnational narcotics organization. Narco-terrorism is also not to be confused with narco-guerrillas and narco-paramilitaries, who are also separate from one another. Narco-guerrillas tend to be Marxist militia groups fighting a government which engages in the drug trade with the cartels, while narco-paramilitaries tend to be more like far-right groups that have ties to cartels as enforcers who aren't part of the cartel. Now, this video is going to cover a few examples of narco-terrorists, but not all cases. Colombia will be the first case study of narco-terrorism, with Pablo Escobar, many communist groups, as well as other paramilitaries fitting the definition of narco-terrorism. Escobar and the Medellin cartel's extent of control in the Colombian government while committing acts of terrorism and the drug trade is pretty well known and is the first major case of narco-terrorism. Other Marxist terrorist groups such as FARC and the ELN have engaged in mass narco-terrorism within Colombia, and FARC in particular has relied on the production and transport of the drug trade to continue their terrorist attacks and mass human rights abuses. The George W. Bush administration enacted Plan Colombia, which pretty much eradicated most drug crops and drug lords accused of engaging in narco-terrorism, including among them the leaders of the FARC group and the AUC paramilitary forces. The Taliban is the next example of narco-terrorism. I don't think I really need to explain that the Taliban did lots of terrorism because there's so many cases throughout the group's existence in the 1990s to the 2020s. To fund their operations, the Taliban sold opium and other narcotics, and the Taliban had officially banned the production and consumption of heroin by the people that they occupied, but the Taliban still strongly engaged in the global heroin trade for cash. In 2021, the Taliban entered into the methamphetamine game to diversify their drug trade and increase profits Walter White style. After the fall of Kabul, the Taliban has been heavily profiting from the international drug trade while in power, earning over $50 billion a year in heroin alone. But the point is that the Taliban relied on the drug trade to raise money for terrorist actions and other activities, as the drug trade for the Taliban wasn't just some side hustle. The KLA is an example of a political group that conducted terrorist actions while also dealing drugs to raise money, but is not a drug cartel. The KLA engaged in reprisal attacks against the Serbs and Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in retaliation for attacks on ethnic Albanians, as the Yugoslav wars were very famous for relentless ethnic cleansing and genocide. The KLA dealt narcotics, specifically heroin, raising $250 million and being responsible for controlling up to 80% of the European heroin trade in 2000. Although the KLA was heavily engaged in the drug trade, narcotics dealings was not what they relied on for their attacks and raising money, although it definitely helped. Next up is Hezbollah, who is heavily engaged in narco-terrorism, as they first began as a terrorist group that raised money through drug trafficking, but they learned that they were very good at it and earned a lot of money, as Hezbollah is knee-deep in the drug trade while also conducting political attacks against civilians. Hezbollah has trafficked millions of dollars worth of cocaine into the U.S. through Latin America alone and has been allied with the Los Zetas Mexican cartel. In 2008, DEA launched Operation Cassandra to disrupt Hezbollah's operations to the U.S., but it was canceled as a bargaining chip for the Iran nuclear deal. Hezbollah has also made parts of Lebanon into a narco-state, however that will be its own separate video. But the point is that Hezbollah is a terrorist group that heavily got into the narcotics trade and has relied upon it to heavily increase their funds to do terrorist attacks. Mexico is perhaps the greatest example of narco-terrorism which flourishes within a state. Now, obviously, due to the many different and many ultra-violent cartels that operate within Mexico and conduct narco-terrorism, I won't be going into them all in this video. For the purposes of this video, I'll only briefly cover the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, which is the most violent and most militarized cartel, and the Sinaloa Cartel, which is one of the most powerful, but however one of the most politically connected cartels. The New Generation Cartel routinely slaughters many innocent people on the regular, but they originally started out as a reaction to the extreme violence of the Los Zetas cartel enforcers. In and CJNG brutally massacred cartel members until 2015 when they began to attack Mexican security forces and openly challenged Mexican state's monopoly of violence as CJNG became better equipped than some security forces in several ways. In 2018, the cartel was alleged to have been responsible for attacking the American consulate. CJNG is ultra-violent but also political, as certain political positions are a threat to the cartel's operations. So, naturally, they kill the politicians or civilians to send a message to the politicians. Mexican President AMLO was alleged to have ties with the Sinaloa cartel and had also passed the hugs not bullets policy towards the cartels and wanted to make peace with them, which has resulted in some of the most criminally violent years in terms of Mexico's history due to the CJNG's activity. Sinaloa has also committed many attacks against civilians but also engaged in Mexican politics and politically motivated attacks. Many Mexican politicians have been killed by cartel members, especially challengers in the Mexican 2024 presidential primaries, as the cartels benefit from certain political policies being passed. Of course, that's just a few brief examples of narco-terrorist organizations. Did you know about narco-terrorism before this video? What other cartels and crimes should I cover? Comment below, and thank you for watching.